Hey everyone, welcome back to Let Me Tell You Why That's Bullshit, the Canadian Election Edition, the podcast where we sort through the spin, the drama, and the flat-out nonsense of Canadian politics so you don't have to. I'm your host, Nicole, lifelong bullshit detector, certified Canadian, and someone who thinks rage-based policymaking should be classified as a public health hazard. Now, today's episode is a big one. We're diving into everything from Trump's so-called Liberation Day, yes, we'll get into that mess, to Mark Carney making the rounds as an adult in the political daycare, and the ripple effects Ontario's economy is feeling thanks to the auto tariffs. Spoiler, it's not just a Ford problem. We'll also break down the major parties are currently promising Canadians, and of course, we'll take a look at the polls, because an election season without a little statistical anxiety is just not an election season. But first, I'm thrilled to introduce a new voice to the pod, Jeremy, who's joining me for the first time today. He's sharp, thoughtful, occasionally too polite, so naturally, I dragged him into this bullshit. Jeremy, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, like Nicole said, I'm Jeremy. I'm a business professional and have volunteered with multiple campaigns at various levels. I'm excited to be here, Nicole.
You say that now. Okay, so we're going to jump right into this without further delay, guys.
We have some very strong opinions and ideas, and I think we'll probably state those opinions now.
All right. Okay. So, Jeremy, how are you doing this morning first? I know things are crazy politically.
I'm doing well. Yeah, things are definitely crazy to say the least. By the way, I should correct you on the pronunciation of my name first.
Oh, sorry.
It's actually Jermyn, by the way, just in case you hadn't realized.
Oh, Jermyn. Okay. That makes more sense. I always so for the record, most of our friendship has been, I guess I would say like digital, hey? Like text-based?
For sure.
Yeah, so I always look at it and I was always like, how do I say this?
You're not the first time. You're not the first time that's happened. A lot of people do that. Like I have people who start calling me Jeremy, and I said, you have to be careful. You don't want to put Jeremy, right?
At least you do, right? Like I know people that their names were pronounced wrong for 5 years before they're like, that's not how you say my name. And then you're like, why did you let me do that for 5 years?
Yeah, I know. I start to do that more often than not now because it makes it a little bit awkward sometimes when people start to add the E or add the Y or change the letters.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, so let's jump into Liberals. We'll start there. They're sort of on top right now. We'll get into the polls later. But yeah, this idea that Carney is really the adult in the room. That's sort of how he seems to be approaching the week. He's sort of been taking I've noticed because he's been dealing a lot in speeches this week because he's had to kind of put campaigning off to the side and look at, okay, we need to respond to Trump. I have to do prime minister things. So it almost seems like to me, he's sort of presenting himself as I'm the adult in the room. I can't deal with you right now, Poilievre, because I have this other stuff going on. So he's talking a lot about economic stability, countermeasures, crisis response. Yeah, so I kind of wanted to open with that discussion and see sort of what your thoughts are on that. So this week, he proposed directly in response to tariffs and other things that are going on, investment in protection for auto workers in Ontario, which is obviously super important because of the 25% tariffs Trump has put on vehicles worldwide. He wants to reinforce domestic part supply chains with investment, and then diplomatic pressure as much as he can put on Americans. So I thought, to begin with, before we jump into our own analysis, we'll just take a quick listen to what he said this week so that people can have some context for the conversation. And there might be an ad at the beginning of this. I'm not sure. We'll see. Can you hear this?
Domestic investors are experiencing.
Looking for clarity on where to invest? Then it's time to partner with Sun.
Yeah.
Boy.
Why is it stopped?
life. As Canada's largest asset manager, we combine insurance and investment expertise to create your personalized plan.
First, we won J.D. Power, ranking Ram the #1 brand in new vehicle quality. Then, Ram 1500
Do you need a new
won
truck, Jeremy?
2025 Motor Trend
Pardon me?
Truck of the Year.
You need a new truck?
Well, you know what they say.
Nah.
You win some, you win
Nah.
some.
Absolutely clear. The Americans are hurting themselves. They are hurting GM. They are hurting Ford. They are hurting American workers. We've seen the first signs of that in the financial markets, dramatic moves in the financial markets, which is telling Americans that are listening, that there are future job cuts, higher inflation, and likely an American recession ahead. So we're going to protect our workers. We're going to fight back. We're going to build. We're going to get stronger. They're going to get weaker. We're going to get a deal in the end.
Statistics Canada is reporting that 33,000 jobs were lost in March, which is the biggest job loss that this country has seen since January 2022, and the unemployment rate is ticking higher. Are these numbers a sign of things to come, and how soon specifically do you think a recession could hit the U.S. and Canada? I think the couple of things. One, as I mentioned in my remarks, there are some tough days ahead. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. And part of the dynamic here in the very near term, in the month, has been about the uncertainty around U.S. tariffs. Now we have greater certainty about those tariffs, or at least the ambition of those tariffs, the actual fact of those tariffs. They're very misguided, so we'll see how they are adjusted over time. We can expect pressure on unemployment in this economy. It's one of the reasons why, prior to this election, we changed the rules on EI. So there is no waiting period now to receive EI. If companies want a job share, you can receive employment insurance. You can receive employment insurance for the portion of that job share. We have changed some of the technicalities, if you will, around the definitions of that drive the levels of EI and the speed with which it's paid out, all of which has been to make the employment insurance provided to workers more generous, more rapid, in anticipation of some of this pressure. But if I can say one other thing and then hand back for your follow-up, what we are doing, what the Liberal Party is doing, what my government will do if we are elected, is to be very ambitious, to control what we control. We cannot control President Trump. Ultimately, he will be influenced by what he is doing to his economy, without question. But what we can control is how we build. We can control the process and the ambition of doubling the pace of home building. We can control the speed with which we do major projects in this economy. We can control having one Canadian economy, which is why the federal government is going to move with lightning speed to get out of the way. And let me just make one point here, which is that, one final point, which is, it's too late to make one point, but I'm going to make one final point. Is that the scale of the negative impact, which will be more immediate, understood, from U.S. trade action, we can more than give ourselves back by having one Canadian economy. We can give ourselves far more than they can take away.
Yeah. So let's just start there. Like, what are your thoughts on, I guess, how the crisis is playing a role in this election?
Yeah, there's two parts that I could take on this thing. The crisis is definitely playing a huge role on this election, for sure. The first part, of course, we're talking about the Liberals here. Mark Carney is trying to be the calm, the stability, the prime minister-like person in this conversation. And that seems to be working for him right now. He wants to be that adult, whereas you look at some other people, they're not being that adult in that room. And
some other people.
Yes, and we'll talk about those other people later in the conversation, for sure. Another side of it is that he has that ability to, he is the prime minister right now in a crisis. And that's another part of it. He has that ability to have the media at his forefront. And whereas other people, again, we'll talk about those other people later, that they don't have that ability to have that media on them during that time. That saying, I would only, he also has that, smartness that a lot of, other candidates don't have. So I think that also includes being that adult in the room. And I think he's trying to say, the stability is speaking louder and more confidently than usual.
Right. And I think it's kind of interesting you bring that up because there's two things here, right? The first is he specifically said this week in a quote, this is not about ideology. This is about economic stewardship, which is very I think part of it is that he hasn't run a campaign before, right? So he's not adhering to, I guess, regular campaign tactics, which is great because this is not a regular campaign. On our other podcast, Rio and I have talked a lot about how this foreshadows sort of that 1988 trade election from the past, and we haven't seen anything since. But the other thing that has happened here because of the crisis is it is no longer a deficit to be the incumbent party in Canada. Since COVID, we have seen incumbents fall all around the world because of their response to COVID, because of economies tanking. And then Trump happened. Trump came in and threatened Canada's sovereignty, our economy, and suddenly being the incumbent wasn't such a bad thing as long as you weren't Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, and I think it's funny you bring that up, because like you said, incumbents used to be a problem, especially when Justin Trudeau was in power. And that we'll talk about later, but I think that's another thing that people are looking for stability right now. It's a time of war, technically. It's a time of crisis, and people are looking for, not to say the elder statesman in the room, but they're looking for someone with a steady hand. And like you can see in other elections in the past, in Ontario, for example, Ford was able to win a majority government even though he was an incumbent. So I think that having the ability to be stable in a technically war situation, because we're having a war, maybe not so much of a fighting with bombs and stuff like that, but we're actually fighting economic war right now. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. And I think Mark Carney, based on the fact he understands economics a little bit, is also kind of trying to be calm because he's had that experience of handling these big crises going forward.
Right. Well, and I think it was interesting too, before we go, because I do want to talk about Ontario's economy, but I was just thinking as you were talking to, it was interesting to see what happened as well with Trump when Carney took over from Justin Trudeau. Because if you remember, he basically said, I'm not talking to you until you show Canada some respect, and basically you grow the F up. With sort of that underlining message. And it was maybe a week later that Mark Carney finally did have that phone call with Trump. And I don't know if you saw the quotes, but Trump spoke later from the Oval Office that day and said that he had a really good phone call with Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, which is a big shift from the governor messaging we were getting before. Now, I don't want to lean too much into that because Trump 5 minutes later could have been calling him governor again and threatening Canada. But I think there's something to be said about the difference between how Carney reacted to Trump right away and how Justin Trudeau reacted to Trump right away, because I think there's a lot to be said about the psychology of a bully. We saw journalists, world leaders, including Justin Trudeau, go down to Mar-a-Lago and basically kiss the ring and suck up to Trump as soon as he got elected. We saw all through November and December that was happening from all kinds of world leaders, which on the one hand you get, right? You want to try to build rapport with this person. But when you're dealing with somebody that is working so deeply within because his end game is power. He doesn't actually care about the American people. He doesn't care about what's best for the people around him. He cares what's best for Trump, which we see in his peddling different scams. He dropped that digital coin like 3 days before he became president and made billions of dollars off of it. He's still saying that his approval rating is like 70%, which we all know is insane, and it's more like 42%. So yeah, like, what do you think, I guess, just about like the different approaches that Justin Trudeau took versus Mark Carney, and how that sort of immediately impacted the election? And we'll talk about Poilievre later, but there's a definite contrast in like Poilievre and Carney.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in what you said there.
Yeah, right?
That, I could unpack like 3 or 4 different things, but I'll try and focus on the 1 or 2 things that are most important and most related to this conversation in this situation. The approach is what I'll first look at, and I think that approach to be honest with you, it was surprising, to say the least, that he considered Mark Carney as a prime minister. Like, when I first heard that personally, it was just amazing to hear that sound of prime minister, and the fact that he didn't call us the 51st state of the United States, which is a total another issue in itself. But it's like, it was exciting to hear that. It showed that he has respect for this person. Maybe he's scared of Mark Carney, but who knows at this point. But there's a lot more respect he has for Mark Carney than someone like Justin Trudeau, which I'm not saying Justin Trudeau was the best prime minister, but nor was he the worst prime minister we've had. But at the same time, he seems like he has that a bit more affectionateness for Mark Carney, which he didn't have for Justin Trudeau. Sounded like he didn't respect the guy, right? Which, fine, I understand him. I think it also comes back from the fact that Mark Carney has a lot of industry experience, but also has a lot of government experience. And I think that also relates to that. But also, I think having the fact that, Mark Carney being that is more of that statesman than Justin Trudeau would ever be, is somebody that I think he realized he can't bully as much. Like, he can't throw Mark Carney under the bus.
Yeah, I think too, the difference is Justin Trudeau was always like super diplomatic, right? It took him months to finally come out and say, like, Trump's serious, this is a problem. Like, he was always trying to be like diplomatic about it, right? Whereas Mark Carney is also not a politician. He is a little bit similar to Poilievre in the sense that, like, he cares about what comes out of his mouth, but he also kind of doesn't, right? Like, he's much more respectful to reporters. But I noticed specifically when he talks in French and he's taking on questions and trying to answer, if he gets frustrated with a reporter or he thinks the question is, I don't want to say stupid, but like irrelevant, he'll shut it down. And we saw that a couple of weeks ago when he started taking his first French questions. He said in French, "That's enough. I'm done with this question." So I think there's just like also just that difference in approach. And so Trump doesn't necessarily see him as much of a pushover as Trudeau.
Yeah, and I think that comes from a lot of experience he brings to the table, right? And I think Mark Carney has that ability because he worked in business, he's been in business, which is Trump's background according to what they say, right? And so I think that ability to relate is so important, right? And the ability to talk at that level. Yes, like, Mark Carney is so much smarter than Trump. We know that for sure, right? In terms of education and also in terms of experience-wise, but that's up to debate anyway with everyone. But I think it also shows that ability to kind of take things a different approach, right? And he's not afraid. He's not your typical politician, like you said. And I totally agree with that. I think that has a lot to do with how he handles things and how he deals with things, because he's not there to necessarily buy the votes like Justin Trudeau used to do, right? He's there to say it the way it is and how he feels. Yes, he might be more eventually reined in and more polished, because when you're in the political sphere, you tend to be a bit more reined in and polished. But I think right now he's still learning how to even campaign, let alone even how to be prime minister. It's a new job for him, right? And so he doesn't have that baggage that Justin Trudeau had, right?
Well, and it's interesting you bring that up because I think that in itself is putting Poilievre and Carney sort of in the same level, because yes, Poilievre has been in politics since he was 20 years old. It's been over 20 years at this point, but he's never actually been the center of a campaign before. And we'll talk more about this later too, but he also had a different role before, right? So he was known as Stephen Harper's attack dog. So he was like very negative, and like his role in a campaign was like go out there and just like attack. So Stephen Harper can then go out there and be like the prime minister, right? And very like diplomatic and send out the message that he needs to send out. So I think like just that, and then Mark Carney being new, puts them at a very even level, which is interesting because Jagmeet's saying this is like what, his second or third election. So he's like very seasoned. So even in looking at the three of them, you can see like almost like who the politician is out of these three people that are currently running. So it's quite interesting. Okay, well, let's move on to Ontario's economy then, and talk a little bit about the tariffs, the 25% tariffs on the automobile industry. Doug Ford obviously recently won re-election, so he's in for another 4 years. Mark Carney announced this week specific investment protection from the Canadian government for auto workers to kind of tide them over in the hopes that like a bunch of people won't lose their jobs. Which we know hasn't happened because a bunch of people did lose their jobs as soon as that was announced. So I'm just trying to think. I think the best place to start here is just to explain what this looks like, the 25% auto tariffs, because I don't know that a lot of people understand like how integrated the automobile industry is, because this isn't, I think Power and Politics put it best yesterday. This isn't about the Canadian automobile industry or Mexican's automobile industry or America's automobile industry, because the automobile industry in North America is the North American automobile industry. We have a very integrated system of where parts are made, where cars are assembled, where other parts are made. And on average, parts cross the Canadian and American border up to 7 times. So that doesn't mean that the end product of the car is just tariffed at 25%. That means that every single time one of those parts crosses the border, it's tariffed at 25%, which is just going to keep getting added onto the end cost of said vehicle. So this is like extremely damaging, particularly to Windsor, Oakville, and Oshawa, because they're like our 3 big automobile manufacturers in this country. And then, of course, we have Ford, who comes in and wins re-election. And this has sort of been his fear all along, right? This is why we saw him putting so much pressure on America and saying, we're just going to cut off your electricity if you do this. Like, I'm not screwing around here. So let's talk about this. I've sort of been talking a lot. So why don't you sort of give us your take on how you think, like, for example, like, do you see these countermeasures working? Like, and that's the thing I worry about here, right? Like, Mark Carney's like, we can get through this, investment protection. One of the things he talked about last week was how he's not going to run a deficit in Canada's budget, because even though he's going to cut and rein in, he's going to make it so that for every dollar the Canadian government is spending, private industry will match like dollar for dollar. But my worry here with Carney is like, he hasn't really explained like, how is this all going to work? Like, what incentives are you going to give to the private sector to like make these investments, especially when you have like our biggest sectors in Canada currently under attack from Trump with energy tariffs, etc. So it's not like they're going to have a lot of money to suddenly like invest in public projects. Like, am I crazy here? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. There's several things to unpack there, for sure. And, I totally agree with you. I am worried too. Like, I am really worried about saying it, naming it, isn't a solution, right? It has to be was followed by action. And yes, he's proposed a few different things. Yes, he's talked about things that need to be done. Yes, he said things need to be that the government and the companies will match. But until it's reality, it's not really a reality. So, am I worried? Yes. Am I optimistic? Potentially, right?
This is where we differ. You're so much more optimistic than I am.
But at the same time, do I think he can do it? Yes. But at the same time, does it need to be followed by action? Yes. And is there enough action involved in what he has to say? No. Um, the
Or
problem,
even
right?
just a plan of like how, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and that's
what's
the,
the
and that's the
thing?
that's the action part, right? You need to have a plan. If you don't have a plan, it doesn't help. It's just like any other politician saying, "I promise this thing, but we don't know how we're going to do it, or don't know when we're going to do it." It's only theory. Like, remember, like, you have to look at these things and say that these are people's jobs, these are people's pensions, these are businesses, and these are working families. I think people forget how many times that car goes back and forth between those US and Canada borders. Like, it's like 3 or 4 times, if not more. So he needs to take a firm action, which he's already identified the conflict and identified the crisis, but he hasn't proposed real sound measures to actually do it. Do I agree? Do I feel optimistic that he could? Yes. But at the same time, has he done it? No. But at the same
Yeah,
time,
yeah. And I think like what's interesting here too, and a huge red flag from both parties, is they've both basically alluded to like, here's a high level plan. Like, here's the thing I'm saying, but we'll tell you how we're going to do it after. And that's a red flag for me, regardless of whether you're talking about Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre. And I think, at least for myself, and maybe like this is different for you, because I actually like, I realize I don't know like how different we are on the political spectrum either. Like, I'm more, I would say, like center leftist type of like mentality. But what we have here, which is really interesting, we haven't seen this in over a decade because Justin Trudeau was like super far left. Like, he was a far, far left liberal, arguably probably one of the furthest far left liberals we've had as prime minister in a really long time, certainly over my lifetime. But now we have this choice where we're basically faced with Mark Carney, who is a red Tory, and Pierre Poilievre. So much so that their policies are overlapping quite a bit, right? So if we look at like housing as an example, both of their approaches are, we need to build more houses. They both have conservative approaches in doing this, but slightly different. Like, just like that tweak, right? Like, Mark Carney wants the investment from private sector and government, whereas Pierre Poilievre wants to sell off federal buildings, 15% of federal buildings, to turn them into affordable housing, and he wants to cut the GST on new houses. Yeah, so like, it's a huge red flag for me. I don't know how like you feel about this, but I guess I'm more sensitive because at this point we are dealing with two conservatives, one who's a billionaire, one who we don't really know what his income, like his net worth is, other than he will play ball hockey in $2,000 sneakers. So neither of these people are exactly like your auto factory worker that they can relate to, right? Like, it's the same issue.
yeah, and I think you brought up a good point. Was that actually was the fact that none of them are actually working people, right, as you would call it, right? Because
Like working class.
yes, exactly, right. And I think that's what you have to distinguish too, because yes, Mark Carney is filthy rich, bluntly saying, and Pierre Poilievre is a career politician. Like, so both of them don't really represent fully the auto workers, if you want to look at it that way. In terms of like, I'm not really going to get into political spectrum necessarily. I know you said you're a left
It's more
a
just
less
like
liberal.
trying to figure out like.
Yeah, I'm more of a fiscal conservative, if I put it that way. I'm more of
Okay,
center
yeah,
right,
kind of the same. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
but I'm on the fiscal side of it, of course. And I've
Mhm.
always been that way. Remember, I work in business, so
Yeah.
I'm a very fiscal person anyway. But at the same time, I realize that these social programs that have been proposed are really important, and unfortunately, they're trying to get the people who are working class. But the problem is that is hard because they're both technically acting more left leaning, right? But they both don't share the same views of the working class people, right? There's a lot of things that they're trying to bring in those things, but at the same time, they're starting to play over to each other's strengths. So you have the conservatives trying to really, how do you say, trying to really draw in those working people, and then you have the liberals trying to draw in those working people. Is it working? I don't know, right? It's hard to say, but at the same time,
Working better for Carney.
definitely for Carney, for sure. But at the same time, there's a lot of other factors that Carney has going for him than just that, right? But at the same time, it's hard because they need to draw those people to vote for them. Like someone like me who's a fiscally conservative person, just generally, right? It's just, it's hard because you're saying like, I don't want to spend money, but if I can't afford a house, there's another problem, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's tough, right? Like you said. I mean, I think my husband actually put it the best. So he tends to be like, he's interested in politics, but basically right now he's just like, everything sucks so bad that he's really limiting his intake to sort of like the most important things, right? So when he saw that Carney and Trump like had a good phone conversation, basically because I was like, oh, well, this is like a little bit of like optimism, right? And he was like, no, billionaires are gonna billionaire. Like,
Exactly.
I was like, oh, great.
Well, the thing about him is that he can relate to each other, and that's what I think is that relationship thing. If you start criticizing Mark Carney, you know how weird that would be. Like you're criticizing another billionaire, you're criticizing another person that you somewhat at your equal playing field. Not to say educational wise, right?
And I guess like here's the thing that, and I should say like up front, like it's pretty clear that I am more Carney than I am Poilievre, and it's definitely kind of leaning towards like a strategic vote for me for sure. Like I will take Mark Carney any day, personally, over Poilievre, and I think that's really important to sort of like state my dog in this fight, if you will. But that doesn't mean that there aren't like red flags that I'm seeing within Carney even this week. So like the China thing, right? He stood by a candidate who literally said we should hand over the conservative candidate to the Chinese government. Like that is scary. Like that is not okay. So there was that. And then on top of that, there's just this like, I guess like his circle, right? So he's worked with Trump in the past. Both him and Poilievre have been highly criticized for their Brookfield involvement. But then if you also look at like Carney's political atmosphere, one of the things he was heavily criticized for when he wasn't sure if he was going to run and then he announced he was going to run for Liberal leadership is he didn't really talk to Canadian media, but we saw him talk a lot to US media. One show in particular that he did was The Rest is Politics US, which is, if you don't know what this show is, it is a show done by Anthony Scaramucci, who was Trump's communications secretary, I guess is what they're called there, communications secretary for like 9 days. Mark Carney and Scaramucci are very good friends, which is how Scaramucci was able to get 1 hour with Mark Carney on that Friday. And interestingly enough, the next day, Mark Carney only gave Rosemary Barton 16 minutes on her show on the Saturday morning, which might explain, you might have noticed how like angry Rosemary Barton seems to be when she like asking Carney questions. I'm like, I am so sure it has to do with that. But getting back on topic, like that atmosphere of like who he's worked with politically, who his political friends are, is telling. Yes, people like Scaramucci and Cohen left the Trump administration. One of them paid dearly and was imprisoned. But these are still like Scaramucci is not like some left-wing pharmacare person. Like Scaramucci is a Republican. He is a never Trumper, but he's still a Republican. So like it does make me a little bit nervous that Mark Carney isn't really explaining his plans about like, okay, how are we going to get private investment? And then you look at like the people in his orbit.
Yeah, you make a good point there. And that's kind of the concern I share too, is because I know all about that working community mindedness of politicians. And yes, Mark Carney is smart, educated, whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, he doesn't. Do I like Poilievre? I think we can assume we don't, right?
Does anybody really like Poilievre, though? It's kind of like Trump, right? Trump voters said, we don't like Trump, but we voted for him on the economy, which is like a whole other hilarious thing. Mm-hmm. And I think Poilievre's sort of the same, right? Like people don't like Poilievre.
Yeah, but at the same time, you know, like I know you said you don't like him necessarily. I don't trust the guy, if I'm honest with you.
Yeah.
That's the biggest issue I have. Like when you can, like I know we'll talk about it later, but you know the problem I'm having when you can't even provide a policy to the people, and when you're criticizing this, you're not really offering a solution to it. Do I like Mark Carney fully? Like you said, no. I like. Do I think he adequately represents my view? Not necessarily. But do I think he's better? Yes. And I think we have to realize strategically who the best candidate is there. Yes. Is Carney very smart, educated? Yes, those are good things. But at the same time, do I think he is like my dad or like my family? Not necessarily. Like his family is super rich. He went to one of the best universities in the world. I didn't do that, right? So I think you have to take that as it is. But at the same time, is he talking and relating to us? And is he doing a good job with the whole crisis in Ontario and other places like that? Yeah, he's a stable hand. And I think that's what we need right now. And is he a politician? No. And that makes it a nice situation that he's from the outside, even though people may disagree. But he's run big organizations. He's been part of business, you know, so he has that working experience, which we will talk about later, which Pierre Poilievre doesn't have. And that, for me, scares me when you have a guy who doesn't have that experience there to handle these things. He cannot manage things. He's never been, quote unquote, a big player, right? And Mark Carney can play at the global stage because he's been at the global stage.
Right. That's a great segue. I think we've covered like most of the liberal stuff. So let's actually move on to Poilievre, since we've sort of kind of done that anyway. Okay. And what I wanted to start with was a big problem that I think that we're seeing. And I should also mention, because I forgot to at the intro, for all of our listeners, I'm going to have like all of these links in the description box below. If you want to like check out more in depth to what's been said, I'll make sure to post like the full Carney speech as an example so that you can go and like listen to it yourself, because I think that's super important to do. But yeah, like back to Poilievre, I think the place to start with him, because I think it's one of his biggest problems that have come out this week. We talked sort of in our pre-show about how in a unifying manner in terms of amongst conservatives, there is no unification right now. And that extrapolated to federally is going to be a problem, because right now Canada, as we said, like we're super unified. The Poilievre and Singh are having problems in terms of like having to be really careful about how they're criticizing Carney, because Canada's so unified and Canadians are not interested in, you know, Poilievre, say, coming out and being like, the way Carney's dealing with Trump is stupid and he shouldn't be doing that and he should be doing X. Like, that's going to make things worse. So that unification piece is so important. But this week alone, we had Preston Manning come out, which I'll let you talk a little bit about because I know you were following that story, but also Danielle Smith. She has sort of been a stick in the mud, I think, this whole election for Poilievre, and I'm sure he wishes she would just stop talking. Obviously, there's pre-election, there was a lot of like sovereignty talk. She's not, well, she seems to have come on board in the last couple of weeks with the virtual meetings that the premiers have had with Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, and saying like, yes, this needs to be like unified, which like kind of threw me because that's not something that she has said before. But I think she likes the fact that Mark Carney's focus is that pipeline, because one of the things he came out this week to say was, we need that pipeline across Canada, like no ifs, ands, or buts. And I think he wants to work with particularly Quebec, right? Because they've always been the holdup on that pipeline. Yeah. So thoughts, Preston?
Yeah.
Manning?
Yeah. The Preston Manning situation is a little bit of a mess.
Insane.
Yeah, and a little bit insane. You know, I was listening to something and hearing things, and it's like, honestly, really? Like, I think my mom put it in great terms, actually, when I was talking to my mom about it one day. She said, Preston Manning is irrelevant right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think for our listeners that don't know what happened, so Preston Manning came out this week. He is the former Reform Party leader, which is kind of the closest to what we see now. But he said that the Liberal victory under Mark Carney could lead to Western provinces seeking succession. Specifically, he said voters need to recognize that a vote for Carney Liberals is a vote for Western secession.
Yeah, and like I like what my mom said. He's irrelevant right now. He's, not to say age is a matter, but he is in his 80s, if not 90s now, and so it really.
But I would argue that like that doesn't necessarily isn't a bad thing. Like look at Chrétien. He's been like out there talking, and he is like, not only is he like crazy articulate for the 94-year-old that he is, he's still very like he knows what he can say without like screwing this up for Mark Carney. Like he's on Liberal messaging. And then you look at the Conservatives, and they're just all over the place, and not even just like Preston Manning and Danielle Smith. Like Harper's former campaign manager is on Power and Politics now, and an exact quote from him this week was, "Yeah, that's weird. I don't know what they're doing." Not where you want to be as a conservative. And
you look at, for example, like Pierre Poilievre say that we need to have unity. So it's totally like, what is the message they're trying to come together? They can't even get the right message, let alone know what they're even trying to say, right? And you throw these fires into unity, and it creates a problem for Pierre Poilievre. He's trying to get the moderate voter. He's trying to focus on certain types of people, but he's not doing that. And you have these conservative people like Corey tonight coming out to say like this, and you have Danielle Smith coming up with this, Preston Manning coming up with this. It's creating a bit of a messaging.
And Doug Ford, don't forget Doug Ford.
Yes, Doug Ford
saying, I am not taking sides in this.
Yeah, and it becomes a mess, and he can't even endorse Pierre Poilievre, and that's a problem.
Somebody that should be playing politics as a team sport.
and it's like becoming more of an issue for him. He can't handle these things, right? And it's becoming, and like I know, like they were saying, like they say there's a mess, there's internal fighting, and all of this thing, and that's creating so much more problem. And you have Preston Manning, for example. We're on Preston Manning coming up to say this. It doesn't help him, Pierre Poilievre, get that vote he needs to get, and it's becoming more of a landfill and a minefield of a situation for him to deal with. He's having trouble pivoting for things.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's important to remember here is Poilievre has another major problem, and that major problem is, well, Canadians for the most part don't like Trump anymore. There's far less support for Trump in Canada than before, which is crazy in of itself. Like, I don't understand why we were seeing Trump stickers on cars. Like, that was like a whole other thing. But here's the caveat. The support for Trump that does still exist in Canada Where are those voters? Those voters are Pierre Poilievre voters.
Yes.
Albertans are the last sort of province where you're going to find, it was something like, oh, I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but it was something crazy like 30 or no, it wasn't 30%. It was 1 in 4 conservative voters in Alberta would want to join the United States. That's a crazy number. That's like 25% of Alberta conservative voters. And like conservatism in Alberta, basically like the Conservatives are going to sweep, right? They're going to win like 34 seats in Alberta. So that's not a small number of Albertans here. And that's a problem. How do you cater to the center and make sure that you're coming down on Trump? Well, the majority of your base, like the people that are consistently going to vote for you, are Trump supporters. That's a problem.
Yeah, it definitely is a big problem too. Yeah. And that's the one thing that I think he's struggling with, is because he needs to appease to those people. And he has to tailor things towards those people. But at the same time, when you have mixed messaging between what you stand for, what your party stands for, and also you have these people who are very influential in the party, let alone very influential in conservative politics, come out and talk and give you mixed messages, that doesn't help either, because that makes it very difficult for Pierre Poilievre to even stand on his own feet and to really know what the party stands for and to know what even he should be standing for. Because if he's trying to appease those voters, he has to take on these crazy stances and these outrageous comments. But at the same time, he's having trouble getting the moderates to the party. And
but
so
I think that goes back to the trust thing you were talking about, right? Like, remember, there's still pictures floating around of Pierre Poilievre taking coffee to the convoy truckers.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem if you're a centrist voter.
Yeah, and a lot of centrist voters can't support that, right? And they won't support that. And you have Daniel Smith trying to play hardball, which also doesn't help either, right? And you have Daniel Smith even stepping into the situation, like trying to say, hold off on the tariffs until until this election's over. Like, why are we doing this? Like it sounds like there's like some weird messaging and weird stuff going within that party. Like, Daniel Smith has this list of demands for Mark Carney. Great to have the list of demands, but then you sit there like, wow, what's going on, right? You can't even deal with these things, right? And
Yeah.
Like it's off strip, you could call it, right? And
oh,
like
100%. Every time Danielle Smith goes off script, I'm sure another hair off Poilievre's head like falls out in frustration, because he's just like, please stop talking. You're not helping me.
And then you have like Poilievre like trying to pivot and trying to do all these things, but he's having trouble pivoting because he can't pivot because he has to respond to all these things, and it's hard for him to even respond and even stand up for what his party or what he would do as prime minister, because mixed messaging would arise.
Yeah, well,
right?
and I think the other problem he's having is that rage has worked for him his entire political career and in the last 6 months until Justin Trudeau stepped down. And the fact that they have such high numbers of people showing up at their like rallies, I think is sort of like reinforcing like stay the course. So I think like that's sort of a problem for him too. Like, he's just like mentally he's having this block in like, I need to pivot.
But I don't think it's also his mental block. I think his capacity is also very ability, because he's always been attack dog. Like you said before, he was Prime Minister Harper's attack dog. And he's always had that persona, I have to attack, I have to attack, I have to attack.
Yeah.
And when you're prime minister, you can't just attack. You have to be sometimes the statesman, you have to be steady, you have to propose, you have to put things through. He is having trouble even becoming that elder statesman, that prime minister, right? Because he's never done that. He's always been that attack. And now when he tries to attack Mark Carney and says carbon tax Carney, this and that, like it's like,
And then Carney eliminates the carbon tax.
Yeah, like Carney's doing all these things to do these things. Yes, maybe we don't know for sure whether these things will still be around, but at the same time, he can't talk seriously because he keeps on attacking. He has to find a reason to attack because he's always done that.
Yeah, and I think something that's a little bit interesting in this as well is that we're seeing people, and it goes back, I think, to like trust and likability as well, in that people didn't like Poilievre. They didn't want Poilievre, but what they didn't want more was Justin Trudeau. Because we saw like that week that he stepped down, suddenly the Liberals, like, they didn't like skyrocket, but you suddenly saw like NDP voters came Liberal. And then Mark Carney announced his candidacy and it skyrocketed. That's where it really started to take off and present that problem. And to me, it's just crazy that Poilievre doesn't understand that Canadians didn't want the things you were doing. They were working because they hated Justin Trudeau. Well, I mean, maybe not hate, but they were like done with Justin Trudeau. Like Canadians were like, we need something different because this is not working for me. So like with that said, like this might be a good time to just sort of let our listeners know kind of what Poilievre has come out to say about economic messaging this week. So the big thing that he talked about was tax-free savings top-ups. There's a few things here. So the first is that he wants to add $5,000 Canadian, obviously, but only if you invest that in Canadian companies. So right now, in 2025, you can have $7,000 in your tax-free savings account, which there's different ways. Like you can have it in a GIC account. You can have it in, like, I have an investment tax-free savings account, which, like, thank you, Trump. That's doing great right now. But there are different ways to like use it. And so this $5,000, he wants it to be invested in Canadian companies. Now, it might sound good, right? Like who doesn't want to support Canadian companies? But what he's saying here is that if you take that $5,000 and invest it in Canadian companies, those Canadian companies are going to have more capital to then invest in the Canadian economy and like boost our economy. There's several problems with this. And as somebody that comes from a finance background, I'm sure you're completely aware of this. First off, that's not how stocks work. Stocks are traded between stockholders. So while the bump in, say, a big Canadian stock right now, and the only thing that's actually propping up my tax-free savings stocks account is Shopify. They're doing quite well. They've still fallen, but like not as much, right? They're definitely benefiting from a higher stock price, but like it's not giving them more capital that they can necessarily just invest in more business. Like that's not how it works. Secondly, 92% of the 8.5 million Canadians that hold tax-free savings accounts don't use the full amount because they can't afford to. So it's like, let's say 1.5 million then use that extra $5,000. Then you run into the problem of, okay, so 1.5 million people can take advantage of this $5,000 top off. But then how do you define what a Canadian stock is? Is it defined by who's employing people in Canada? Is it defined by 100% Canadian owned? Is it okay if it's a half American, half US company? Like, again, there's no like plan here. He said, I'll let you know after I get elected.
Yes. Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah, for sure. And there's several problems with that. The number one part is that, first of all, not all companies, even though quote unquote they're Canadian owned, are actually Canadian owned. Because when you talk about Canadian owned, what is the definition of a Canadian owned company? Right? Is it 100% owned by Canadians? Is it 80%? What is Canadian owned? And a lot of these companies are multinational companies. They're across borders, they're across countries. And so it's like, what do you define as Canadian owned necessarily? Like lots of these companies, even in Canada, have ownership from companies in the States, their parent companies or their subs, their own in the States. And so when you talk about Canadian owned, that needs to be defined. What is a Canadian owned company? Number two, the plan that he says after I know exit, I'll give you a plan. That's like telling me you want to buy something, but you don't know what you want to buy. You'll get it later. You'll find out later. That is a problem, because in an election, you should be provided with, this is what I'm going to do. This is how it's going to affect me. This is how much it's going to cost. And this is how it would benefit me. So if you're not giving me a plan now, that's a problem, because you are expecting the voters and people to trust you, which may not be what you want at the end. And that's a big issue. Yes, like the $5,000, not a lot of people can even max out their factory savings income. A lot of people in their younger years can't even do those things. So how would that won't even benefit them anyway is another issue. So I know lots of people who can't even afford to even use like investment to do that, right? So there's a lot of things that are not ironed out in that plan, and it's hard to even know what he's proposing.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing here is like, I guess watching that, it really like, it's the first time I got really like raging mad at Poilievre. Like there's been a lot of things he said, and I'm like, that's just not gonna work. Like parts of his housing policy, and like when he announced that he's going to take off GST for new homes and that kind of stuff, right? Like there was no real like, okay, that's not really going to fix the affordability problem because you're not addressing rent. But I think this was the first time that I got really angry, because there's also the question of, at the end of the day, Canadian stocks aren't necessarily where you want all your investment to be. If you look over the last 20-year history, year over year, they go up half as much as the stocks we see in the US, right? Like myself, I have Canadian stocks, but I'm very, very selective about the Canadian stocks that I do have, right? As I stated, one of those is Shopify for obvious reasons. So like for me, I was like, that's not necessarily in the best interest of the working Canadian. So like $5,000 isn't really that much investment wise, right? But that amount of money could be a lot of money to a middle class person who's looking at like, I have very little money to put in every year into an RRSP. And now you're saying like, go invest in Canadian stocks, which could actually do worse under all of these Trump tariffs because we're currently in an economic war. So like, to me, I was just like, you're not looking out for like, this policy in and of itself helps more rich businesses. Like, of course, Shopify, who is one of the billionaires in Canada, wants you to invest in their company. And while I think that, yes, they are a good investment, like you don't want to put your eggs all in one Canadian basket. Like it's just not smart investing at this point.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you on that, because full disclosure, I have both Canadian and US
Me too,
stocks.
yeah.
And like, to be honest with you, my US stocks are outperforming their Canadian stocks. And not to say the Canadian ones are not good, but at the same time, sometimes the US ones pay actually better dividends than the Canadian ones. And so why, if I'm an investor and I'm about low risk, I want high returns, stuff like that, and if I want a high dividend stock, I have to go US to invest in my stocks. And some of those tech stocks are better returns on dividends than some of the Canadian ones. And so why would I invest in a Canadian company if I have a choice to invest in a stock in the United States that pays so much better? And
even with the downturn.
Yes, even with the downturn. And I can tell you, I've done really well on the American stocks. The Canadian ones I've done okay. Like some of the good stocks that you can invest in, yes, I've done okay. Have they done as well as the US ones? No. And so I wouldn't want to park all my money in a Canadian company, right? To be honest, I don't even have Spotify because it doesn't pay the dividends I want it to.
Yeah.
Right.
And they have a crazy, their stock price is so high. Oh my God.
Yeah. And honestly, like, yes, some of the American companies I invested in are super crazy. I remember like about 5 years ago, I invested in one that was $425 per share. Like in the United States, has it been an amazing return? Yes, but it seems that that's an American company, not a Canadian company.
Yeah.
And like people want to invest in like Google, Apple, Tesla, places like that. Qualcomm, Broadcom. Those are tech companies that are really long-term companies that pay amazing dividends,
And who will weather this one way.
and we'll weather them. And like, look at, you talk about microchips, and those are companies that have those technologies that are needed. Like you talk about computers, you talk about iPhones. They are the companies that will make money. They're not the small companies won't make money, and some of the Canadian companies won't make money. So you can't just throw in the $5,000 there that they don't even have potentially. $5,000 is a lot of money to put in stocks if you're not going to make money from them. Especially,
or if you have a very few stocks, because like $5,000 isn't a lot to invest in stocks at all, really, especially when you're dealing with like US, like our dollar is low on top of that. And so then you're going to put it in US stocks. Like I think Apple's at like, it was at like last time I looked, which was before like the tank, it was at like 280 USD a stock.
Yeah.
So $1,000 of Canadian money isn't going to go far. Even if you put it into a Canadian company, like Shopify was like 190 Canadian. So $1,000 is not going to go far.
Yeah, and like the investment thing, I always tell people, my friends, not to give it investment advice because you should seek professionals to do that.
Yeah.
But I always tell my friends is that don't just buy 1, 2, 10 stocks. You need to buy like actually a substantial amount to make money, because investing in a couple stocks is not going to make you money. It's going to pay minimal dividends. Like it's going to pay you 5 cents maybe on your dividends. And
I got an email this week that was like, you made 81 cents in dividends. And I was like, thanks.
And like, it's not going to make, like, you cannot, like, that's going to not even cover inflation.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, that's what I always say to my friends is that you need to invest in a substantial amount. And like someone who has a mortgage or has other things like family stuff, $5,000 could go towards a mortgage payment or go towards a car payment or whatever it might be that is more beneficial to them because they need to pay that down. So they can't afford that money to put $5,000 extra dollars. And also to talk about, the new home buyers GST thing, if they can't even afford to buy a house, how can you, like, it won't even help you, right?
Well, and you know what's interesting about that is that the GST thing, so there's a big difference in how Mark Carney approached it and how Poilievre is approaching it. So Poilievre is just like flat out removing the GST. Mark Carney, on the other hand, said up to $1 million, which if you think about it from like an economic stance is actually quite smart, because you have like economies like in Vancouver and Toronto where like shacks are costing like over $1 million. New homes, like new home builds for just a regular family home is quite up there as well, over $1 million. But if you suddenly have the government of Canada saying like, no, you don't have to pay GST up to $1 million, there is like, it's not going to solve everything, obviously, but there is that potential. Banks are going to say like, no, we're not giving you a mortgage for like $1.5 million. Your like limit is going to be this, right? Because that's where the government of Canada has also set that like no GST, and the banks don't like giving out more money than they have to. So like capping it there is actually quite smart, especially when you look at like first-time home buyers. They're not buying like 3-story houses. They're buying like condos and townhouses and stuff, right?
But you also have to realize that in Vancouver and other places in Toronto, the houses are $1 million minimum. So it only really affects certain types of people who can even afford those houses, right? And those houses, like you go buy like an apartment, it's like $1 million apartment in Vancouver or Toronto. So like they can't even buy a house necessarily. They're buying an apartment or a condo or whatever.
Which is who Mark Carney's targeting, right? Like he's only targeting first-time home buyers. You have to be, it's only for first-time home buyers. But again, his policy doesn't address rent. Neither of them do.
And that's a problem. Rent is expensive. You hear rent in Calgary is crazy expensive. You hear rent in Vancouver's crazy expensive. Toronto.
Everywhere.
And you hear rent is crazy. I remember there was a study last year that came up from Calgary that said you need like $80,000 to pay rent and be comfortable or something like that. And then you need $100,000 to buy a house and pay your mortgage payments to feel comfortable. How is that even possible? This is Calgary. Vancouver's even worse. Toronto's even worse. Other places in Canada are even worse. So it doesn't even make any sense. Like rent is the big issue. If people can't even afford the house, where are they going to live if they can't even afford their rent? And $5,000 is part of that rent payment, right?
Yeah.
So you need to, I think these policies need to be more ironed out, and they need to be more kind of
and give it a little bit of thought. Like even half a second of thought on that, right? So like, okay, so let's move on and talk about Poilievre's tariff stuff.
Yes.
Because it's also riddled with problems. So let's start. We won't talk too much about this because we already did, but there's the mixed messaging again from different conservatives, right? Some want retaliations against Trump. Some claim that Trump is misunderstood and it's just a negotiating tactic, which, like, if you're still there, like, give your head a shake. And former Harper allies, as we also talked about, are publicly slamming the party's incoherence on everything. And so let's actually play this video to sort of like show how Poilievre is talking about this, and then we will talk about the actual other policies that he's come up with. Play.
Once again, like all Canadian leaders, forced to address yet another attack by President Trump against our economy. Here he goes again, attacking his closest neighbor and America's best friend, with new tariffs that will drive up the cost of living for American consumers and drive down American wages, while damaging a historic friendship, the best trading relationship in the world. My message to President Trump is knock it off. Stop attacking America's friends. Start trading so that we can once again become richer, stronger, and more secure on both sides of the border. That is how we will have the money for stronger military and stronger borders to secure our continent against real threats and real enemies. We will never be the 51st state, but we can once again be friends with the United States if the president reverses course on these disastrous tariff threats. If you decide to go down this road, this is what's going to happen. Yes, you'll do damage to us in the short term, but we will fight back and we will build back. Within 4 years of a new, strong conservative government, Canada will be completely rebuilt. We will rebuild our economy. We will not be reliant on the U.S. anymore, and the Americans will have lost the greatest trading partner and friend they ever had. A conservative government will build pipelines and LNG plants, aggressively promote mines and other resource infrastructure that has been blocked for the last 10 years. We'll have new overseas trading partners. We will knock down interprovincial barriers so that we can trade with ourselves. We will send our goods to our friends on other sides of the oceans of the world. We will cut taxes and speed up permits so that we can sell our oil, gas, mining, lumber, agriculture, fisheries, manufacturing, small businesses and large businesses alike. The world needs our resources and our expertise. If you, Mr. Trump, don't want them, the rest of the world does. Under a new conservative government, we will put Canada first for a change. We will be a nation that is strong, self-reliant, standing on its own 2 feet so that we can stand up for ourselves and stand up to the Americans.
So much to unpack.
Yeah, there's so much there.
Right. So the one other thing that I want to add to this, because he didn't talk about it there, but he did cover like basically everything he talked about economically this week with that, with the exception of actually 2 things. So the first is the GST waiver on Canadian vehicles, which again has the same problem, which we won't go into, as the tax-free savings account. How do you define a Canadian vehicle? Because they're North American vehicles at this point. And then the second thing that I think is really important to keep in mind as we go into this conversation is that if he wins, he wants to renegotiate NAFTA, or what was then renegotiated as CUSMA. which Trump has already said that after the election, they'll sit down and like hammer out a plan.
Mm-hmm.
But Poilievre did say this week that if Trump then reneges on that new thing, they'll just renege on our portions. But like the big thing the US has always wanted from Canada is security. So are you telling me you're then going to renege on our security commitments during a time that Trump could potentially start talking about wanting to take over Canada again? Like,
yeah, I don't know.
There's so much here.
There's so much here. Okay, so first of all, I think I'll cover the knock it off remarks because I think that's the easiest to cover off. And then we could start to slowly go through the others. To be honest with you, the knock it off remarks is outrageous, okay? What we're saying. It is not a strategy for handling a bully. It's not a strategy for handling a guy who is narcissistic. It's not a strategy for handling someone who is going to take over your country. And it's not a strategy for dealing with the tariffs going on in the situation right now. Knock it off is technically telling someone to stop doing it. And that technically has no merit and no weight in anything. And to have Pierre Poilievre say to just knock it off, I'm sorry, it doesn't add anything to the conversation. Yes, it might say that we don't want to be taken over and all this stuff, but it really doesn't propose a proposal idea. That's a totally different thing now, right? But at the same time, there's a whole other thing. You talk about negotiations of, NAFTA. You talk about, like capital gains tax. You talk about GST waiver. Those could take hours to discuss. There's so much to unpack in those situations. The GST waiver on Canadian vehicles. Can you tell me what is definition of a Canadian vehicle? Anyway, I don't remember the exact number. I think it was 3 or 4 times. That vehicle goes back 3 or 4 times.
Up to 7.
I think 7. That's crazy. And so you're technically tariffing every single time it goes over and over and over. So 7 times 25, I think it is.
And then how is that a Canadian vehicle?
Yeah, and it's not even a Canadian vehicle. So like it doesn't make any sense in terms of policy.
It sounds good.
It sounds good, yes. But again, if you can't even afford to buy a house, you can't even afford a vehicle, is it going to really matter to you?
It's the same problem as the tax-free savings account thing.
Yeah, exactly. And so it only affects certain people. And if you're in the lower bracket, you won't even buy a new vehicle. You'll probably even be lucky to have a used vehicle, let alone an older 10, 15, 20-year-old vehicle. So that proposal doesn't even affect the people they need to help, right? And if people are losing their jobs because of tariffs, they can't even afford to even buy their vehicles they're producing too. So that's another problem, right? So there's so much trouble in terms of handling these conflicts. And I don't think he's thinking these things through. Like, I know economists compared to Bart Carney by any means, but it doesn't make any sense to me. And like, honestly, like my mom finally bought a new vehicle after how many years of a new vehicle? Like she had a used vehicle. She never bought a new vehicle for many years. This is finally she bought a new vehicle. And is it an American one or a Canadian one? No, it's an Asian one. Like it's an Acura. Why? Like so it doesn't even wouldn't even affect her, right? And so it doesn't even matter, right? Like I have a friend at work. She wants to buy a new vehicle, but she's going to buy an Acura.
Yeah.
Like Canadian vehicles sometimes are not. People want to buy. They don't want to buy the Canadian or American vehicles because they're not as good quality or they're not as reliable.
They're more expensive.
Yeah, things like that.
He is still around.
Yeah, but the idea is like having the idea is okay, but at the same time, if my mom bought a Acura, for example, she wouldn't have got the GST waiver on it anyway.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't matter.
It's the same. It's the same problem, right? So I don't know. I just feel like one person in this campaign is serious and the other person is not. Or at least like doesn't know how to like figure their crap out to be able to do it. Like we talked about, right? Like he's got so many different things going on within his voter base. And then he's also trying to cater to the middle, which just not working. And he's trying to rely on things that sound good. Like it sounds good that you're not paying GST on homes. It sounds good that you're going to get more money in your tax-free savings. It sounds good to cut GST on vehicles. But when you actually take 2 seconds to think about it, that's not going to impact very many people. You know who that's going to impact? People that are making $150,000 plus a year.
Yeah, and it's the people who it's the people who can afford those vehicles too. It's a new vehicle too. It's not a used vehicle even too. It's a new Canadian-made one. But what is a Canadian-owned vehicle? What is a Canadian-owned corporation? You tell me. It's hard to even define that, right?
Yeah. So I guess like for me, this is my bottom line between Poilievre and Carney. Poilievre, instead of focusing on like tangible, resonant economic fixes, he's caught between like internal struggles and basically outdated tax strategy that is similar to Donald Trump's outdated tax thinking, just in terms of like, we are not in the 1930s through 60s anymore, guys. Like, come on. Swing voters are walking. Progressives in the middle are fired up. It's causing, you know, people, which we'll get into in a minute here, from the NDP side to go anything but conservative, move over to liberals. And Poilievre's base, we don't even know like who these people are at this point. Like there's just so much, there's such a mix in there that it's making it really hard for him to be able to have that consistent message. Meanwhile, Carney is boring, like very focused on methods. Yes, his planning needs improvement, but he's keeping calm and he's being a prime minister. So that's sort of like my bottom line. What's your bottom line between these two before we talk about Singh?
Yeah, the problem I'm having is that Pierre Poilievre is not relying on experts. There's a lot of internal conflict going on in the Conservative Party right now. And I remember they were saying is that he's not relying on anybody around him. And he definitely does not understand economics. This is a different world. This is a different economy. And these are old, outdated tax cuts or tax gimmicks, right? That are not really not helping the average person. Like as an average person, you cannot afford these things. But yet he's saying these are the things I want to tailor to you, and these are the things I want you to handle. And that's the problem. He's not understanding the economics. Is Carney doing better? Yes, there's some things he needs to focus on for sure. Definitely things he needs to iron out. But at the same time, he's acting like a prime minister. He maybe has that ability because he is the prime minister technically to be the prime minister. But at the same time, Pierre Poilievre is not helping it by proposing these old antique things that do not relate to the people who are moderate and the people who are working class people that he's trying to target. And you can tell by talking about these things, he doesn't understand economics. He doesn't understand the business of that. And I think that comes from the lack of experience he brings to the table in terms of everyday people. He's never worked on a factory floor. He's never worked as a working person in an office. He's only worked in government and in opposition mostly. So he doesn't have that experience that comes from that. And so my takeaway is that Mark Carney is doing okay. He's doing a better job than Pierre Poilievre, but still has a lot of work to do going forward.
Yeah, for sure. Which brings us to the NDP. Now, I don't want to spend like too much time on the NDP because they are basically irrelevant at this point in this election, but they are Canada's like third largest party, and this isn't going to be something that lasts. Like, we'll probably see it in the next election. Things will steady out. It'll kind of depend on who the Conservatives come up with a new leader, because if Poilievre blows this 25-point lead that he had from December, like, you better believe there's going to be a leadership review and probably a new leader put in. So it'll kind of all depend on that and like how Mark Carney does. But I do think it's important that we at least like kind of talk about where Singh's tone is at. So from what I've seen like this week, it's been kind of interesting because he almost like switched his tone from like, I'm an alternative to be prime minister, to more of a, it's really important that we send as many NDP MPs to Ottawa as possible to make sure that we're like holding the Conservatives, the Liberals accountable if they do win this majority government. That's sort of where he's been this week. He's obviously calling on more worker protections, which is nothing new from Singh. He is obviously calling out like auto workers specifically, which makes sense. A lot of it's kind of echoing what Mark Carney's already also doing. So there's been that. He's still pushing national pharmacare, which is great. He's attacked Poilievre on his stance on worker legislation, which is totally fair. We didn't talk about it, but we've talked about it on our other show before about how Poilievre's history with anti-work legislation is right there in the votes during the Harper era. We know where he's going to be at. Singh talked a lot about like stronger climate policies, taxing the wealthy at a higher rate. He's not really focusing too much on Trump. Like, I think he has kind of the same problem as Poilievre because he doesn't want to anger his base, which is even more of a concern for the NDP, especially as we'll see, they're looking at like 5 to 8 seats nationally at this point. What do you think? Does that about cover where the NDP is sitting at?
I think it does. And I think, unfortunately, his voice is getting a little bit lost. And I think his messaging is a little bit mixed at times too, because the problem with the NDP is that right now they're struggling to even maintain the third party status right now. And I think the biggest issue that they're struggling with is that people are flocking to Carney right now. And I know that it's Jermyn Singh's third election. And so his seat, I forgot to mention earlier about Pierre Poilievre, that's another story too, is that both their seats are on the line because the Conservatives have thing in their constitution that if you lose the election, you cannot come back as leader, I believe. So there's a bit of
it says that there must be a leadership review.
Yes. So there could be a leadership.
Basically is the same thing, but yeah.
Yeah, technically that's what happened with the other leaders that came into power, came in. So I think but Jermyn Singh's situation is a little bit different because he's third time running. And so if he can't improve the turnout of the NDP seats, he really can't really be a leader because he's not helping the party grow.
But he has a fallback in saying that like this election was ABC, and so he like it'll be interesting to see what happens from the NDP because there is that like it's not my fault sort of path.
Yeah, it could
potentially take.
It could be, but at the same time, what do you define as your fault, right? And that's what you need to really figure out. Is that yes, Jermyn Singh could say it's not his fault, but at the same time, are his party or members going to agree?
Yeah, but this was his third election. Nobody tossed him the first 2 times.
Yeah, but then again, if he ends up losing third party status, do you really want to have a leader like him still?
Well, yeah, but this is the Trump factor, right? People are so scared. And this is like a great transition to the polls, right?
Yeah.
So like we're looking at the NDP is actually up this week. Mm-hmm. And the Liberals are down, which I think is really interesting because it signifies that there are a few NDP voters that are going back because they're like, okay, the Liberals are safe. They've got this. I can vote like my usual NDP way. So that's quite interesting. But given that it's his third election and the first 2, there wasn't very much talk around like, you're not doing a good job as leader and getting the messaging out. When like arguably the most successful party during the latest round of government was the NDP. They got a lot of their policies pushed because they were propping up the Liberals. So like one of the things that I don't understand from Singh is if I was like an NDP card carrying member that was like more involved at that level, I would be asking those questions like, why aren't you talking more to the Canadian people about like how you got the pharmacare stuff passed? Like all of these things was from the NDP side. Like they got more done and more of their agenda covered in the last 3.5 years than any other party. But he's just like, it's like crickets from him on it. And I think like if I were Singh and I lose like catastrophically here outside of losing my own seat, like if he loses his seat, then he's got a real problem. But like just given his personality, the fact that he didn't step down after losing 2 elections, I'm not sure that he won't take a path of, well, this isn't about the NDP. It was about the NDP voter base. And this he's not like would be wrong on. It's about how the NDP voting base looked at it and said, okay, well, I don't really like the Liberal platform, but I definitely don't want Poilievre in here right now. And that's always sort of been what keeps the Conservatives out of power in Canada. For the Conservative Party to win, they need to be up around 40%, which Poilievre is at. He's at like 37% on average through CBC poll tracker, which is like an amalgamation of all of the polls in the country. But they also need to rely on the Bloc and NDP doing well, which we saw during Harper's first win. Him and Jack Layton basically worked together, and Harper propped him up because he knew, he looked at the orange wave and went, there's no way that he will win prime ministership. And if I can like bump the NDP up, it's going to like split the left and I'm going to win. And that's how Conservatives get in. So if I was Singh, I would just be like, this is totally not my fault. And I would put it past him.
Yeah, I definitely think Jermyn needs to do a better job of doing that, because it's definitely getting lost a little bit right now. And I think there was another thing they said, that Jagmeet Singh's seat is actually in trouble right now.
Very much so.
So if he loses his seat, there'll probably be a leadership race or a review of some sort, because like that's a problem. And so
you can't be a leader without having a seat in the House.
And that's going to be an issue. And especially if he goes from losing party status to losing a seat, that is a big issue. And
yeah, because you need, so for our, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you too much, but for our listeners, you need 12 seats in Canada to be recognized as one of the official parties.
Yeah, and so you need to really, really be careful here. And yes, he did the pharmacare. Yes, he did all of this stuff, but it is getting lost a little bit between the twos, right? And they're thinking of it between Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre. And that is not a good sign for the NDP, which has been instrumental in the last parliament of proposing and passing these important things. So Jermyn has to do a better job to come out and talk about what he's done, but also fight for those people. But something is not coming out properly with that party.
Well, and I think the thing that's not coming out is this is an ABC thing. This isn't anything but Conservative. Like, look at these numbers. Like, if we just look here, right? The Bloc has lost half their seats since January. When Rio and I first started tracking this, the Bloc was at like 30 seats in Quebec. And as any party leader will tell you, you do not win an election without winning Quebec and Ontario. And right now, this is flipped so hard. The Bloc's down to a projected 16 seats with 6 to 26. So like it could potentially be worse for them than those 16. But Quebecers, a big thing here is that Quebecers don't, as you were saying, they don't trust Poilievre. And a major thing, one of the things that I've taken away from listening to Good Talk every week is listening to Chantal on that show, who is a French reporter. And one of the things that she's been saying for months is Poilievre goes after the media, which everywhere else in the country, people don't care about. Like, they should, but they don't care that Poilievre is rude and dehumanizes media. Quebecers, on the other hand, see their media as their voice in sovereignty. So it's really, really bad for any politician to go in and treat Quebec media poorly. And unfortunately for Poilievre, he's always done that. And with the polls the way they were 6 months ago, he had no reason to pivot. He's trying to pivot now, but as Chantel pointed out on Friday, people aren't buying that. So we can see that the Conservatives have just like completely crashed in both Quebec and Ontario. And that's a problem. I mean, this map is crazy. Like, can we just take a second to like take in what is happening on
Yeah,
this,
it's absolutely
this
crazy.
polling map?
Like you can see the change.
Like,
And honestly, it's one of those situations that you sit there and you're like, wow, time is changing, right?
yeah, it's amazing what one leader will do. And that's sorry, I'm gonna share now the CBC poll. Like the CBC poll has always been a little bit like behind or like lower than the 338, only because it's the way they do it is they like take all of the polls into consideration, and then newer polls are weighted heavier than older polls, but it is basically an average of all polls. But like even in the CBC one, like if we look here, 44% for the Liberals, 37.5% for the Conservatives.
Yeah.
And the New Democrats are down to 8%. Like this is unheard of. And I don't think I've ever seen, like, even when I did a historical examination, going from a 25-point lead to basically neck and neck, which this isn't even really at this point. Like the Conservatives have a major problem. Yeah, it's absolutely crazy, the fork that Trump threw into this election. And it's showing via the left on Canada really wanting to keep out Pierre Poilievre. That's what I think this comes down to, whether that's because they don't like conservative policies, whether that's because generally like a New Democrat voter, obviously they're the exact opposite on the political spectrum. So they're not going to agree with the policies. And then you have somebody who is sort of unpredictable going up against Trump. Like, I think that's just the perfect setup for even the Conservatives being polling at numbers where they would normally win to basically be destroyed. Oh, you're muted. Okay, polling thoughts.
Yeah, it's definitely a weird situation right now, for sure, right? I think, like you said, it's anything but conservative right now, and that's what people are looking for. Is that they're looking for that left party that is progressive, that is standing up for more of the Canadians and someone they trust, right? And Pierre Poilievre is not, unfortunately, that person they trust to handle things like Trump and other situations right now. But at the same time, it's one of those situations that it's coming at the expense of the NDP and other parties at the bottom. And Jermyn is struggling to even find that ability to, and to emphasize the stuff that he's done in the past to make himself pull up. But at the same time, it's not surprising because they see Mark Carney as a statement and prime minister right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy. Okay, let's move on to our last topic. We've been here a while. I'll let you take the reins on it because you kind of were the one that wanted to talk a little bit about an op-ed piece that was written this week. From what I can tell, this is the only person in the country who doesn't think that Poilievre should be focusing on Trump, which is quite a hot take.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to bring it up is because it's an interesting op-ed. You know, like one of the lines I thought was really interesting because they talked about in this particular one, they talked about that he must continue to focus on Canada and not Trump, and that, you know, that he needs to talk about these things. And I sit there like, okay, so if you focus on Canada, that is one part. But when you don't focus on Trump, which is one of the biggest issues right now, and the biggest problems that is in the world, and even now the entire world because of the whole tariffs across the world. And if you're not focusing on the right issue, then you're not going to even move forward and grow your base. I think to have someone say that they can't focus on Trump, it makes me a bit of a weird, like, why, what's going on, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I read this, what I kind of took away from it wasn't really. I think that their message got a little bit jumbled in what they were trying to say. But after like reading it twice, I think what they're trying to say is basically what Danielle Smith was saying was, could you just shut up so that Canadians forget about Trump? Because if Canadians don't have the Trump factor problem, the Conservatives are back in the game, which isn't wrong, really. Like, it's true. But there's two problems with this. Number one, Trump is not going to shut up. He is not capable of shutting up for multiple reasons. One, he's a narcissist who needs all the attention on him. Number two, he doesn't really care ultimately who wins our election. He views Canada as, I mean, so my friends and I, my US friends and I always laugh at each other because they'll be talking about like liberal Democrats. And I'm like, guys, you don't know what a liberal is. Like you have conservative and conservative light down there. And they kind of feel the same way about our politics, right? We have like liberals and then liberal light, right? Like conservatives in the US would never have universal healthcare. And like there's an argument to be made about how like our conservatives are getting farther and farther right. And, you know, there are people like Pierre Poilievre who have talked about wanting to like privatize healthcare. We have that problem in Alberta. So we are moving that way. But like generally speaking, we are a fairly liberal country. So like Trump really doesn't give a crap who wins our election. Like he's just so full of himself. He doesn't think it matters. And maybe it doesn't. Like he has the power to economically ruin us. And so that's kind of what I took away from this. Like it was almost like this author was like, you need to remove Trump from the conversation. But it's just not possible. Like I don't.
Yeah.
I
totally agree with you on that but at the same time, I think what I'll add to that, I think the reason why he believes that Pierre Poilievre needs to start reminding Canadians of Trump is because Pierre Poilievre's base is partly Trump's base.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it. But at the same time, how can you remove Trump when you have the biggest economic war in the world going on, right? So it's hard to even really remove Trump.
I mean, and it's not just an economic war. I think if we're going to look at this from like a global perspective, Trump is literally trying to revamp the global order from post-World War II. Like, remember, and this is I wrote a piece for our website about this. The maddening thing about this, and every time I hear Trump talk about how, you know, they're like carrying other countries and how like, we owe them and blah, 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 and how like, oh, why do we always have to be the one to like save Europe, right? Like the Signalgate stuff this week and how they were mad because they feel like Europe should be the one dealing with the Houthis. Houthis? I don't know if I said that right, but dealing with them when in fact, like after World War II, the US was the ones that stepped in and said, we will do this because we don't want anyone else to have nuclear weapons. So they managed to like talk out a bunch of countries from like having nuclear weapons. And they were like, we will play the world protector. And it's not like they haven't like economically benefited from that in massive ways, right? Like they basically have not veto power, but they are like a huge voice in everything globally. Their currency is the reserve currency. And with Trump's like revamp of all of this, like nobody's going to trust the US anymore. Like Poilievre, this is the other thing that irked me about Poilievre. Poilievre was talking about how like he needs to knock it off so that Canada and the US can be friends again. No, like I don't think any leader other than Carney has, and even then, I don't even think Carney has taken it far. This is something that generationally is going to be a problem. Like millennials are going to be like 90 years old telling their grandchildren, you can't trust the US. Like that is that is broken to like massive degrees now. Like this isn't a 4-year thing. And so like I think people forget, like the US wanted this, and you can bet that like Germany's already talking about, okay, we need nukes. Poland's pissed at them. They're like, oh, the hell you need nukes, right? Like Poland still has their Germany baggage. France has a nuclear program. Like this is not a small thing, and it goes beyond Canada. This is a global order revamp.
Yeah, and it's going to affect from generations to come.
Yeah,
and it's going to be an important thing to handle, both from a country's side, domestic wise, but also from a country side, because it's going to affect everything to come going forward. And can you imagine in 20 years or 30 years, like you said, when you're 9 years old and you tell the younger generation that
you can't trust those Americans.
Yeah, you can't trust the states.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big deal. And regardless of whether you like Trump or whether you're a supporter of Trump or whatnot, he is the president, and he has been the president for 2 terms.
Yeah.
Right. And the fact, I know we can go into this later and other places down the road, is that he's talked about even taking on a 3rd term potentially. And that's a totally another issue in itself. And so like, it's just like things are being changed.
I mean, the good thing about that though is like the guy is 80 and he eats like garbage. So the chances of him like still being alive and not being like taken out by a Big Mac are pretty small.
Mm-hmm. And whether you respect, whether you like the guy or not, he is the president of the United States. He'll always be the president of the United States.
Well, he drives that dynamic, right? Like I watch a lot of American podcasts, and specifically I like to watch a lot of the Never Trumper podcasts for a variety of different reasons. But like these people, they're like, yeah, but we didn't want this. And it's like, yeah, but it doesn't matter because this is where we are, and he's doing the damage.
And he's going to be in there for what he's in there. He's a president. He's a former president, regardless of whether you like it or
what
not.
Happens when like say like Trump, for some reason, even though he eats Big Macs every day, manages to live till 90. Even if he doesn't take on a 3rd term, he's going to be in the background like freaking Mitch McConnell was for all those years, driving the Republican Party. Mitch McConnell was never the president of the US, but he had so much pull in the party. And if Trump stays around, regardless of whether it's JD Vance, other people have sort of been flouted, like God help us all if Donald Trump Jr. happens to get in there, because MAGA is such like they have like a almost cult like following. Like it doesn't matter for those like 30% of people. It doesn't matter what they do.
Yeah, and that's the thing. People forget that, and like people say, I didn't vote for the guy, but I said he's there, and so you have to live with it, and you have to.
Americans are still being sent to El Salvador, whether you voted for him or not.
And honestly, like history down the road, you're just going to have to deal with the history of what happens from the situation, and knowing Trump, he's going to be actively involved in the conversation going forward, and like when you look at the situation where he almost got killed by the bullet, the fact that he's the former president of the United States was the fact that he got protected, right? And the fact that he was like that, you cannot.
And turned into like a living martyr. Thank you, guy that shot at Trump.
You cannot not accept that, and he'll always be that person that if something goes wrong and he gets injured or hurt or anything like that, people, whether you like him or not, you have to stand up for the guy because he's your former president. So I don't want to go into any more conversation about that in terms of like just generally, but it's just, it's just that you have to realize that he's there and he's going to be history in the American thing. And so people are going to look back in 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road and say, what happened during that time?
He's going to be in the history books. 100%. He's definitely going to be in the history books for sure. It's just a matter of like what happens in 4 years. Like the guy is old. People die. Like it's a thing. So I think like one of the issues is, does he, and not even dying, like maybe he gets like Alzheimer's and is just completely speaking like not at all, right? Like there's a number of things that can happen. And the problem is we're also like more of a longevity society. Like the guy could also live to be 95 years old and directing the Republican Party from behind those lines. And that is a problem. Like, obviously, we would never be like, oh yeah, somebody should assassinate Trump, because don't do that. That's horrible. He's still a person. Like, don't do that. But there's also like that argument to be made. Like, as long as Trump's old and kind of demented, but still like able to speak, he's going to be directing the Republican Party, and people need to prepare for that. And I don't think Poilievre is like, I don't think it's realistic to say like, oh, we can be friends with America again. Like, no, that trust now is destroyed, because especially if Trump stays around and he's like pushing the Republican Party to like, you know, still be like mega based, what happens when JD Vance gets in the next time, right? And it's still, we're on this path, right? What happens if like the American public, you know, vote for, I don't know, whoever runs, whether that's AOC or somebody else, and a Democrat gets in for 4 years, people get pissed off and then they vote Republican, because that's how that happens. If Republicans are still MAGAs in 8 years, that's still a potential problem, because they could win. So like, it's not like we can just go back to being friends with America. The potential for America to like, and this is the other thing, he's literally not only just revamping the global order, he's making America a freaking Axis ally.
Yeah, I don't want to go into more discussion about that, but like, yeah, and it's something that we have to, something that has to be considered, and something that has to be looked at going forward for sure, right?
Yeah, it's a mess, and like, it's just not easy. It's just not as easy as like, oh, just stop doing it and everything's fine. Like, no, it's not.
No, for sure.
So with that, I think we've covered everything. So do you have any like last minute thoughts for people?
In terms of the election, just get out and vote.
Like, overall,
just get out and vote. I like, at the end of the day, your ability to vote is so important, and people still complain anyway if they don't vote, but at the same time, vote so you have every right to complain. I don't like, regardless of who you support, vote for the person and the party that represents your views the most closely and what you want for the country at the end of the day.
Well, and I think I would add to this, like, don't get complacent, right? Like, don't be like, oh, well, everything's sort of set in stone, because that's not the case. And also, whether that's a perspective of, I want the Liberals to win and they've got this, or I'm a conservative, but there's no point in voting.
And use your voice to vote. Like I said, you know, I like, yeah, at the end of the day, you can see our opinions already, but at the same time, vote for who you feel is the best, that represents your views and what you stand for as a person and as what you want for your country, right? We're not here to tell you who to vote for. We're here to give you opinions, right? Of how we feel on things, right?
But like, also stay informed. Like, make sure if you made it to the end of this podcast, like, also don't take our word for it. Like, go and look through these links, read the different articles, watch what people are saying. I'm not saying that you have to read like everything, because I get it. Believe me, I get it. But like, be informed, get out and vote, because it matters.
And also volunteer and get involved in the campaign if you feel like that speaks to you as well. Because I think getting involved in the political process, whether it's voting, whether it's volunteering, whether it's getting your friends out to vote, is all important. And by not voting, you're also making a statement too as well.
Well, and okay, so like, this is where I also like, I'll just say too, in terms of like people that don't vote, I think that we need to be careful about saying like, if you don't vote, you don't get to complain, because that's not how it works. Voting is a right. Not voting is also your right. So like, I would never say to somebody, oh, well, you didn't vote, so you don't get to complain. Like, you absolutely get to still have your voice. And there are a lot of reasons why people don't vote, whether that's because they don't like any of the parties, which we saw in the US like at high levels this year, or because there's voter suppression. And if you don't think there's voter suppression in this country, you need to go and do some research, because there's absolutely voter suppression in terms of like, especially marginalized communities that, you know, don't have proper IDs and don't have access, and that kind of stuff. So like, I would say like, be really careful about like judging people who don't vote. But if you have the ability to vote, like get out and vote. Don't get compliant regardless of what side you're on. And don't treat politics as a team sport, because I think that that's what we're seeing in the US and why we are where we are. Like lots of people that were like, well, I've just always voted Republican, so that's what I'm going to do. Like, be informed, vote, and yeah, stay involved in the process.
However that is.
Yeah, whatever that looks like for you.
And
okay,
also
guys.
be involved, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, guys, we've been talking for a really long time, so we're going to let you all go. Remember to like and subscribe, leave a comment below. Somebody will get back to you. Probably not me. I do all of the notes and prep work, so Rio's in the comments often, for better or worse. Like, subscribe, share, all that stuff, and we will catch you next week. Bye.
All right. Good night.